So here is some data that I've collected that I'm presenting. A couple years ago, I had this idea I was going to write a paper where I was comparing how different trout regulations affected trout populations and size in streams in the driftless area. And I kind of wrote up a paper and sent it to this not very good journal, and it hasn't been accepted or revised or anything, so I don't even think it's going to get published. So I just decided I'm going to present the data in a PowerPoint by county, and then I'm just going to show how many trout of certain sizes are in each creeks. And this is from the Wisconsin DNR Fisheries database, and they provided me with the data, and I have data from 2014 through 2019. I think for Monroe County, I only have data for 2014 through 2018. So this data is a little outdated, so I would take it with question. Although streams that have a high abundance of trout in them probably still have a high abundance of trout in them unless they've died off from something or the habitat in the stream has been completely altered. And I removed the location on the creek where the survey data was collected, and I took the survey data that they had that was collected by backpack, electrofishing, or various other types of shocking device, and then I converted it to trout per mile and categorized it into different size classes of fish per mile and pounds of trout per mile. And I have data for brook and brown trout. So this is Upper Big Creek. I do not know where this creek is. I don't think I've ever fished a single trout stream in Monroe County. But this stream was surveyed in 2017. They only found brook trout. The average size of the brook trout was pretty small, and the maximum size of brook trout was quite small. At the one location, there was a relatively high number of trout per mile at 815, which is probably really high because it's probably like a 4 or 6 foot wide creek, but I don't really know what it's like. But they only surveyed it twice in 2017. This is definitely not where I go if I wanted to catch big brookies, but who knows, a different stretch of the creek could have big brook trout in it. The next creek I have data from is Lyndon Valley Creek. This stream also only had brook trout in it when they shocked it. This did not have a very high abundance of brook trout, but they did shock a 14.2 incher, which is a pretty good size brook trout for streams in this area. And the amount of trout over 10 inches per mile is pretty high for brookies. And average size is high. The next creek I have data from is Stillwell Creek. This has nothing special to it, just small brookies. And next creek I have data for is Spring Valley Creek. This creek also mostly only had brookies in it. There was a 10 incher, but I don't think they caught like 4 fish in that survey. Next creek I have data from is Spencer Creek. And this creek had brook trout in it also. And the size of brook trout in this creek was pretty small too. The largest size fish they shocked was 9.7 inches. And the average size is pretty small on some of these stretches. Next creek I have data from is Sparta Creek. I assume this is by Sparta, but I could be wrong. I should know more about where these creeks are, but I'm not really familiar with this county. So this creek had primarily brook trout in this location C and D, but in the first 2 locations there was also brown trout. The size of brown trout was pretty small, and the size of brook trout was nothing special either, but the amount of fish per mile is pretty high. If you combine brook and brown trout, there's over 1,000 trout per mile at location B, which is quite a few, but there's definitely not any large fish. So if you probably wanted action, this might be a good creek to fish, but if you're targeting larger fish, this might not be the best area to fish. Next creek I have data for is Soper Creek. This creek also only had brook trout in it. The average size of brook trout was pretty small, though, which is normal for these little creeks. They did catch it. They did check up at 10.3 inches, but definitely not the largest fish found there. A 10-inch brookie for some of these creeks is actually a pretty good sized fish, though. They're tiny creeks. The next creek is Cook Creek. And those initial creeks I added, took the standard deviation and average of the data, but then I realized I had like a couple hundred surveys, so it would take me forever to go and add the standard deviation and average to the data. So then I just, using the data how I had it previously organized, but added the max length limit of a brook and brown trout found in the creek. So on Cook Creek, they found mostly brook trout and only a few brown trout. There were some decent sized brookies though, but not really much for browns. Not super high abundance, but definitely a reasonable abundance of trout per mile. The next creek I have data for is Brush Creek. This didn't have that many brook trout per mile. I guess it's not too bad. Size is all right. They did catch a 13.4-inch brookie, and the brookie size is good though. But that creek might be all right for fishing. The next creek is Big Creek, and Big Creek doesn't have any. It had one big brookie and brown. It had a 12-inch brookie and a 12-inch brown in it, but a lot of the fish probably weren't so large there. But the brookie, actually the brook trout weight is pretty high for that creek though. Next creek is Beaver Creek. There's both browns and brooks in Beaver Creek. It's primarily brown trout though. Reasonable weight abundance per mile. About average size over 12 per mile. Most of these creeks do not have a ton of larger brown trout per mile. And if you watch the max size length from it, there's a couple that have fish that are bigger than 16, but a lot of the streams do not have many brown trout larger than 16 inches. The next stream is the Baraboo River. I actually have fished on the Baraboo River, but by Baraboo. I haven't fished on the Baraboo River up by where it's a trout stream. I'm not sure if there's more trout in it in Juneau County because I know it's a trout stream, but there's a lot of brook trout in the upper part of it, but the size isn't the greatest. It's all right at the one location they shocked. The next creek is Bailey Creek. This only has brook trout in it. Nothing special size-wise. Next creek is Dustin Creek that I have data for. This was surveyed in 2016. Again, just a few little brook trout in it. This is probably a little tiny creek, but I'm not sure how large it is. Next stream I have data for is East Upper Big Creek. This was only had brookies in it, and it has quite a few brook trout in it per mile. Not many pounds per mile. They caught like one or two larger fish over 10 inches. The next creek is Farmers Valley Creek. This creek had quite a few browns per mile and some brook trout per mile. I'm sorry if I'm covering up the bottom corner. So I'm not showing the maximum size of the brown trout for some of the surveys, unfortunately. I wish I could just remove my face. Next stream I have data for is Indian Creek. That just had some brook trout in it. Caught a few over 10 inches, but if you compare that to other streams, that's not a very high abundance of trout per mile. Streams that have like some of these streams that have 1,000 trout per mile on here are not very large creeks, so they have a really high abundance of trout, but some of these other streams may actually be larger, but not have that many trout per mile, which may help the size that the trout are. But also these creeks flow into larger rivers, which the bigger trout can go in the larger rivers when the water's cool, but then they swim up into the little creeks when the water gets warm in the summertime. Jenkins Valley Creek just has some brook trout in it, some little ones. Probably another small headwater stream. This must be the way upper part of the Kickapoo River, because that flows into the Wisconsin River in Crawford County, which is quite a ways from where the survey was done. And they only caught a few brook trout. Next stream I have data from is the La Crosse River. They caught the largest fish in this county, which is a 24.9-inch brown from the La Crosse River. The abundance of trout is really variable on the La Crosse River. My guess is that's because it gets warm in spots, but some of these other spots also had quite a few brook trout per mile. That one location they shot had a lot of large fish in it, although the trout per mile is not very high. It's at 68, but the size of the fish was really large in that survey. Because some of these other creeks will have like 200 pounds of brown trout per mile, which is a pretty high abundance for this area, whereas these are only like 60 or under 100 pounds of trout per mile, which is not a very high abundance of brown trout per mile. The next stream I have is the Little La Crosse River, and this stream has a very high abundance of brown trout, and I only included a subsample of the surveys they had from it, but all the surveys showed that it had a very, very high numbers of brown trout, so I assume this is a popular stream to fish. There is some decent sized fish in here too, although I think the largest fish they caught out of here was like 17 inches, but like out of 1,000 trout, there's only like 10%, a couple percent of the trout though in some of these surveys that are like 16 plus inch fish. So most of the fish are smaller fish. So I'm not sure how big this stream is though, but that's a pretty high abundance of trout. The Little Lemonweir River is mostly brook trout, a few brown trout. Mill Creek here only had brook trout, but some of the areas had quite a few brook trout. It had a lot of brook trout in it, and a few decent sized brook trout. Moore Creek had a couple brook trout they caught, but mostly brown trout. It doesn't have a super high abundance of trout per mile, but it definitely has some. Mud Creek, that's definitely not a trout stream name, and it had a lot of brook trout per mile, so it must have clean water if brook trout can live in it, although weren't necessarily large brook trout. I should have added the standard deviations and average size to all these though, because that would get the weight and standard average and standard deviation would give a better indication of the trout abundance rather than just number per mile, because a lot of these ones that have really high numbers of trout per mile have a lot of really small fish. Rathbone Creek had brook trout in it. It has a few larger fish, but not a lot of larger fish. If I had more times, I could make graphs of the distribution of different sizes of trout, but I don't really have time to do that. So I just made this quick PowerPoint, which still took me like 4 or 5 hours to take the data that I had already organized and put it into tables in a PowerPoint, which tables are the really boring way to present your data. Next stream is Rocky Run. Then this does not have very many trout in it. And it only had brook trout. Next stream is Rullands Coulee Creek. I think this is a pretty popular stream to fish, and I know it has really high numbers of trout per mile too. I think this might flow into Timber Coulee Creek, which is another really popular creek in the driftless area, or maybe it doesn't, but I know this is a popular stream. This has quite a few like 10 to 12 inch fish in it, but the largest fish was under 15 inches. So I'm sure if you fish, you'll catch a whole bunch of 10 to 14 inch fish, but you probably won't catch many like 16 or 18 inches. And there's a couple brook trout. And I think the regulation on this creek is 5 trout under 12 inches, so they want you to keep the little ones to thin out the population. Next creek I have is Sand Creek. That only has brook trout in it. It has an okay abundance, but doesn't have a lot of them. Next creek is Seymour Creek. That had some brown and some brook trout. Nothing special size-wise though. The next creek is Silver Creek. This creek also had a few rainbows caught in the one survey. They surveyed it in like 8 different spots, but only in 2015. It's primarily brook trout in most of the surveys, although one survey had 1,000 brook trout and 663 brown trout per mile. And the last creek is Sleighton Creek, which has some brook and brown trout. Not a lot of trout though. They did catch an 18.2 inches, which is a pretty good size one for these surveys. And the largest brown trout I think they caught in this county was like 24.2. And the largest brook trout they caught I think was like 14.2. But a lot of these streams do not have they did not catch very many large trout in the surveys of these streams. But anyways, I just think this data is interesting to look at. If anyone else likes looking at data and is interested in fish, they might be interested in looking through this PowerPoint. I'm sure I'll get some negative comments on this PowerPoint because I'm just giving data for the creek. I would just suggest to go to whatever creek you feel like trying to fishing and cast some spinners, or fish with whatever fly you like, or even soak worms, but just follow the regulations and don't litter and respect landowners. And here's the source that I got this data from. If you're interested in getting more data, I know this is just from 2014 through 2019. It would be interesting if I did this for more counties or collected or had data for a longer period of time, but I unfortunately don't. That'll be it for this recorded PowerPoint.